Hello, I'm Mariana Siciliano, Managing Educator for Public Programs and Creative Practice at the Met. I'm really delighted to welcome you to day 2 of our virtual convening, People, a global dialogue on museums and their publics. I'm privileged to be speaking to you from the ancestral homelands of the Montaukett people and respectfully acknowledge the Met's location in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape diaspora. Today's sessions will explore the topics of past and present and race and identity. We invite you to use the chat during the presentations and during the panel discussion. Our hope is that these presentations are catalysts for dialogue and that you'll join us in the conversation by participating in the chat with questions and comments. We're also offering closed captioning. You can turn closed captioning on or off by using the CC icon towards the bottom right of your Zoom toolbar. Our program will be recorded and made available for you to view at a later date. To tell you more about our sessions and to introduce our speakers, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Andrea Bayer, Deputy Director for Collections and Administration at the Met.
Welcome, and thank you for joining the second day of People, a global dialogue on museums and their publics. I'm Andrea Bayer, Deputy Director for Collections and Administration at the Met, and I'm delighted to be part of this inspiring convening. This afternoon, we will present 2 sessions. The first, Past and Present, is inspired by a quotation that comes from Shakespeare's Tempest through Zadie Smith. What's past is prologue. And the second will be looking at issues of race and identity in the context of the museum. Our 3 speakers in the first session are Aaron Glass, Associate Professor at the Bard Graduate Center in New York, whose work focuses on First Nations visual art and material culture, with an emphasis on the Northwest coast of North America and the history of anthropology and museums. In his exhibition, The Story Box, Franz, Boas, George Hunt, and the Making of Anthropology, and elsewhere, he has interrogated many important questions about intercultural exchange and display. George Nuku, a leading Maori visual artist from New Zealand, whose practice involves his family and community and others in a widening circle, and whose works in plexiglass and a variety of materials have captured the imagination of audiences around the globe. And Anupam Shah, the head of art conservation, research, and training at CSMVS Museum in Mumbai. He has been a participant in a decade-long program of conservation training sponsored by the Mellon Foundation in collaboration with the Met and other institutions, and is a leading voice in the discussions around the preservation of cultural heritage and conservation in India. The moderator of this session is Dr. Jonathan Michael Square, historian and curator of Afro-diasporic fashion and visual culture, currently overseeing a digital humanities project which he founded called Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom. Each of these speakers is well placed to reflect on the fundamental question that is embedded in Shakespeare's statement. The past is a prologue to what is to come. But does the past shape the future in an inescapable way? Or are we making the conscious decisions that will push the future in new directions? In what ways, in George Nuku's words, is the past in front of you? And how does that impact the way in which we walk in the world? Thus, the urgency and relevance of the prompts put to the speakers to think about the histories of colonialism or white supremacy as potential catalysts for transformation of art, or perhaps to engage as yet with underrepresented histories, and the constant need to bring past and present into dialogue. We are all deeply aware of these questions because, quoting a work by Robert Colescott, knowledge of the past is key to the future. It's now my pleasure to hand it over to our session's participants.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to say Gila Kasla, thank you to the symposium organizers for the kind invitation to be here, to my esteemed fellow panelists, and to all of you out there for joining us. Thanks also to a former student of mine, Laura Allen, who worked on the exhibition I'll speak about and an earlier version of this talk. I'm speaking from the island of Mannahatta in the heart of Lenape-Hoking, ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, and past, present, and future home of Indigenous people from around the region and the world. But I'm projecting myself into the ceremonial big house in Yalis, Alert Bay, on a small island in the territory of the Kwakwaka'wakw people in what is now called British Columbia, which I'll abbreviate to BC in the talk. In early 1897, anthropologist Franz Boas gathered page proofs for a new book at his home in New York City, where he revolutionized museology as a new curator at the American Museum of Natural History. He mailed these pages to his Indigenous research partner, George Hunt, in Fort Rupert, BC, where they had recently conducted fieldwork. Boas enclosed a letter for Hunt to translate and read in the Kwakwala language to village chiefs to garner support for the book's publication. His plea used the declamatory style of local oratory. Quote, "My friend, George Hunt, will show you a box in which some of your stories will be kept. It is a book I have written on what I saw and heard when I was with you 2 years ago. It is a good book, for in it are your laws and your stories. Now they will not be forgotten," unquote. While trafficking in the period discourse of salvage anthropology and its assumption of Indigenous vanishing under colonialism, Boas also invoked a local cultural idiom of the storage box for hereditary treasures, the physical and metaphorical repository of chiefly status and genealogical transmission. He knew that laws and stories are made manifest in masks, songs, and dances performed in the ceremonial potlatch. He was now banking on their ability to be further mediated and maintained into the future by a unique form of Western inscription, the ethnographic text. This letter provided the title and the theme of my 2019 exhibit, The Story Box, Franz Boas, George Hunt, and the Making of Anthropology, co-developed and hosted by Bard Graduate Center in New York and the Utmista Cultural Center in Alert Bay. The exhibit explored the hidden histories and complex legacies of one of the most influential books in anthropology, Boas's 1897 Social Organization and Secret Societies of the Kwakiutl Indians, a result of his work with Hunt among the Kwakwaka'wakw. Our displays included ceremonial belongings, as well as rare archival photographs, field notes, and drawings that shed new light on the book and help reactivate the cultural heritage it documents. The book was groundbreaking in its ethnographic detail and holistic approach to culture, but it obscured 3 central conditions of its own production: Canada's colonial ban on the potlatch, which lasted from 1884 to 1951, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, where the 2 men conducted much of their primary fieldwork, and Hunt's unacknowledged status as the book's co-author. Moreover, Hunt spent his final years producing over 600 pages of corrections and emendations to the book, in many cases by retroactively linking published museum objects and recorded songs with their kinship units. The exhibit was one part of a larger project I co-direct to produce a new critical edition of the book in both print and digital formats, with the twin goals of providing a critical historiography and returning long, inaccessible materials to the Kwakwaka'wakw. This was an exhibit panel on the larger project, laying bare the current collaborative research into the history of this foundational collaboration. The exhibit itself emerged out of 2 graduate courses I taught at Bard that enabled student collection research, written interpretation, and design contributions. I also worked with Corinne Hunt, a Kwakiutl artist and great-granddaughter of George Hunt. And on tours, Corinne and I liked to point out that I'm the great-grand student of Franz Boas, so there's a lovely genealogical parallel there. Corinne created custom graphic designs and installation concepts. One design was applied to the opening vitrine, treating it as a customary bentwood storage box holding the book. Corinne's notion was that the form line motifs from this box would float free on large pages, carrying the book's elements, the objects, and the stories backward and forward in time as we told the story of the book's ongoing legacy. In some places, her designs landed on walls and platforms, turning the gallery itself into a storage box. Our curatorial challenge was large for a relatively small show. One, to interpret the artworks and archive using both Kwakwaka'wakw and anthropological genealogies of knowledge and practice. Two, to display our reflexivity about the process of scholarship itself, both past and present. And three, to tell a layered narrative that was comprehensible to multiple publics, interdisciplinary scholars, know-it-all New Yorkers, in-the-know Kwakwaka'wakw, and tourists to Alert Bay. We wanted to offer not our own definitive knowledge, but rather a complicated history of the co-production and reproduction of knowledge, of multiple ways of knowing. The primary story in our story box was about what and how we know, and about what we don't know and why. A brief word on some expressions of our community relationships. This was the first partnership between Bard Graduate Center and an Indigenous Cultural Center, and a central concern was privileging Kwakwaka'wakw audiences in Alert Bay, but also in New York and online. We raised extra funds to bring to New York a sizable delegation from BC, most descendants from George Hunt. The morning of the opening, the group held a private blessing of the exhibit. Pillows from a gallery office were hastily, but carefully unstitched to generate the bird down needed for a customary cleansing of the space. And you can see some of the down on the vitrine, which we asked the custodial staff to leave there for the run of the show. That night, the group properly opened the event with songs and dances, some linked to masks or recordings in the exhibit, dramatically demonstrating that the laws and stories have not been forgotten, helping close the gap between the past and the present. And that's Corinne Hunt as Zunakwa, the wild woman of the woods, on the left, and unmasked on the far right. Rather than do a print catalog, we redirected funds towards loans, media, and traveling the show. We did produce a free oversized brochure with a transcript of a curatorial dialogue between me and Corinne. At the request of Sarah Holland, Umista's director, the centerpiece of this was a fold-out poster, not with an artwork, but with an image from the 1893 Chicago Fair with all of the Kwakwaka'wakw troop members named for the first time. Sarah rightly predicted that this would be one of the most compelling items for community members who scrutinized the archival photo for faces of their kin. We also built a comprehensive website with all of the exhibit content plus additional essays and media, in part to ensure that it would be accessible to all of the Kwakwaka'wakw who could not make it to either exhibit venue. And we prepared a panel version of the exhibit for Umista to loan to other communities. So we definitely kept our graphic designer quite busy. For the rest of my short time, I want to reflect upon three overlapping curatorial strategies that we used for managing multiple authors, temporalities, and publics. Our unique label structure, our use of digital media, and a focus on the present as a frame for the past. The exhibit was laid out chronologically to tell the story of making and remaking the book. The first case featured Boas's field notes, letters between the two men, discussing the book's needed revisions, Hunt's personal copy with his marginalia, and Hunt's later pages with extensive revisions and corrections. Our thematic labels had a distinct editorial structure, with the image of the lone item in Boas's book and his original caption, emendations by Hunt that confirm, correct, or in the case of these masks, contradict Boas's caption, and interpretive text by me and my students that synthesized Boas and Hunt's understandings and our new research. The labels thus make transparent the history of knowledge production and revision. For example, Boas mixed up these two similar looking masks, publishing a photo of one captioned with the catalog number of the other. We made these conflicting data apparent as an example of Boas and Hunt trying to work out historical and iconographical relationships in regional art. Labels were longer than industry standards, but our mandate was to explore this complexity in depth and to provide native audiences especially with resources to reevaluate the historic materials in the book and in the archive. We intended the extensive use of digital media to self-consciously communicate themes of mediation, how media forms, texts, drawings, photographs, wax cylinders, exhibits, intervene in the way cultural knowledge is transferred between people and over time. We privileged current native voice right at the start with a recording of Chief Bill Cranmer, a Hunt descendant, reading in Kwakwala the opening panel's storybox quote.
Lamas iglacus agnuquadasa gichatsi kavatsi.
The section on the 1893 Chicago World's Fair included an iPad with 3 wax cylinder tracks of songs recorded by Boas at the fair and then published in the book. When played, they filled that gallery with voices from the past that helped animate the otherwise static dance regalia on display. Between this section and the next, on Boas's and Hunt's 1894 fieldwork in Fort Rupert, we placed a large interactive screen titled From the Photographic Archive, which reveals how Boas selected and often modified his original field images for the book. For instance, dragging the slider reveals that this decontextualized bookplate of Hunt's son David was actually taken during a dance at the Chicago Fair, a venue for embodied performance outside the reach of the Canadian potlatch band. Perhaps Boas concealed the fair context to help authenticate the book as an anthropologist establishing both his and his young field's reputation. Likewise, a dynamic projection showed how Boas posed in dance gestures that he had seen to help develop mannequins for the US National Museum's iconic Hamatsa or cannibal dance diorama, which is the central image here, which he then used as a book plate. This spectral Boas haunts the gallery, as he does the history of anthropology and the ongoing mediation of Kwakwaka'wakw culture. All this media now lives on the exhibit website, which features additional tools not present in the gallery. For example, the exhibit had a large wall map that plotted the collection locations for loan items. The website features an interactive version that allows native users to easily identify the materials from their own territories. Such digital tools afforded us the ability to expose what the book obscures while actively remediating the ethnographic museum and archive for multiple publics. The last curatorial strategy was to reflexively use the present exhibit to reframe the past book and its archive. Current native voices literally bookended the show, with Chief Cranmer's voice at the title wall and his appearance in a short film at the end, and you can see him on the monitor here. The iPad with the 1893 cylinder tracks also had a current version of one of the songs, which stayed in ritual use over the past century. The final gallery pulled the curtain back on contemporary scholarship, revealing the research process for both the 1897 critical edition team and the exhibit team, both pictured here, along with browsable copies of the book and a prototype of the digital critical edition. Next to this was a map of North America and Europe, showing the global distribution of research repositories related to the book, and a display on repatriation to inform visitors about the current politics of heritage and the pioneering work of our partners at Uumista. Finally, and most crucially, this last gallery exposed New York audiences to the ways in which community members are using the book in project research to reactivate inherited privileges that have laid dormant for a century. Here in the film, critical edition team member Andy Everson paints his son's face with a design revived from Boas's book. All 3 of our strategies culminated in this dramatic centerpiece, a new transformation mask of a supernatural killer whale made by Corinne Hunt and David Knox, and inspired by a poorly documented mask in Berlin on the left that's pictured in the book. In the 1920s, Hunt revealed that the Berlin mask had once belonged to his first wife, Lucy Homiskanis, and he recounted the story of her initiation with it on the beach in Fort Rupert, which we projected modern video footage of, visually replacing it in the territory. The new mask will be danced and validated in a Hunt family potlatch, making it available to Lucy's descendants for ceremony for the first time since the old one was collected in 1883. Before I conclude, just a few words on how we adapted the exhibit for Uumista and its local audience. Due to the expense of international shipping, we prioritized the loan of 3 Kwakwaka'wakw items of regalia and the original manuscripts, books, and works on paper. Local carvers immediately announced their interest in making new items inspired by the loans and by featured reproductions, like the 2 masks here, which didn't travel. In fact, a series of newly carved rattles were added to the show in Alert Bay. The exhibit was adapted to fit into one gallery, with most loan items combined in two large vitrines, which interrupted the show's chronological story of the book's history. Here, we started with the new whale mast and a set of boards pictured in the book that had been repatriated to Umista years prior, and these were the reproductions in New York. There was no Kwakwala language audio for the Storybox quote, and no introductory label on Kwakwakwa culture, as we needed at Bard. The most disappointing change was the reduction in digital media use. While we looped the short film on a monitor, all the other media were delivered via the exhibit website on two old iPads. But if the curatorial narrative and digital dazzle were compromised, the historic regalia and story of the book were enlivened and enriched by being at Umista, in proximity to repatriated treasures and to the living culture in communities that maintain active genealogical knowledge of and connections to the laws and stories Boas and Hunt recorded over a century ago. While such knowledge is rehearsed daily in Alert Bay, it was also made present in New York in both temporal and spatial terms toward the end. It's both temporal and spatial terms. Toward the end of their week-long visit for the opening, William Wasden Jr. led the delegation on a final walkthrough to say goodbye to their kin and to their belongings. This time, he brought a drum and found a seat on the platform in front of the Hamatsa diorama. For visitors to the gallery that day, the scratch and wobble of salvage anthropology's wax cylinder was replaced with the surround sound of survivance. Indigenous people, belongings, and knowledges were essential to the foundation of modern museums and disciplines, even if colonial discourse has elided these contributions. Today, we have a responsibility and an opportunity to work together in museums to resurface these past stories, redress current injustices, and reimagine possible futures. Gaila Kastla, thank you for listening.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is George Tamihana Nuku, and I'm a Māori artist from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm of German, Scot, Ngāti Kahungunu, and Ngāti Tuwharetoa descent. I'm currently based in Rouen, in Normandy, in France, and I spend my time, I like to put it this way, I spend half my life in France, and I spend half my life back home in my in Aotearoa, New Zealand, principally in my kainga, my village of Omahu, and I spend the other half of my life on projects around the world. So I've successfully managed to squeeze three halves into one whole. Yeah. The image I'm showing you first is from my most current exposition project, and today's an auspicious day because today is the day that the exposition actually opens after a 7-month delay due to COVID. So it's a big day for Georgia and the public of Rochefort and in the region of Nouvelle-Aquitaine, where they get to see my current project. I could talk to you all about my last 35 years of work practice, but that would take quite a long time. So I'm just going to, on the chat here, I'm just going to send my email to everyone. So if you're interested in what work I do after listening to me or not, well, feel free to give me an email, okay? Kia ora, thanks. So here we go. This is the affiche, the exhibition poster for the exposition, and it's quite telling in some ways. It was an accident on the part of the people in charge of the art department who were in charge of the poster itself, because they inadvertently made this kind of graphic where the lithograph of the waka, the canoe in blue, which is my choice of color, and you'll see in the show, cuts across the ancestor's face, and doesn't look too dissimilar to a mask that everyone wears. A COVID kind of mask was one of those things where, art and life are mirroring each other, you could say. So yeah, the original date was the 7th of November. And as I told you, it's now opening today on the 19th of May. Now, people ask, why are you interested in Dumont d'Urville, George? Well, firstly, the project itself is held in the city of Rochefort and in the department of Charente-Maritime, as I said, in the Nouvelle-Aquitaine region of France. And this town in itself was once a medieval fishing village, totally transformed, built from scratch, you could say, in the 17th century into a purpose-built naval facility. So France wanted a place where they could be, where they could really raise their eminence as a naval power against their great rival, Great Britain, and at the same time be free from the Protestant Huguenot issues of the day, which was just up the road in La Rochelle. So they wanted a place where they didn't have any of that, where they would have a purpose-built facility where France could compete with their rival. So if you ever visit Rochefort, it's a funny place. It's you have a sense that both time and space collapse there, because it is a complete 17th, 18th century movie set, you could say, where there are no modern buildings. It's all as it was. The difference now is that it's no longer a garrison town as it was. It's a tourist attraction. So, but from this area, the people like Dumont d'Urville, the explorator, and the French brothers Lesson, naturalists of the day, based in Rochefort, and other arms of the Navy were responsible for putting together the voyages of Dumont d'Urville. Other centres as well in France, such as Brest and Toulon, they're all major maritime naval locations for the setting of this project of mine. I became interested in the voyages of Dumont d'Urville in 1990 because I was attracted to the lithographs that were produced from the voyage themselves. What made them different, in a sense, was that these were no longer essentially voyages of exploration. By the 1820s, everything had pretty much been discovered, and prior to it all being carved up, and all the European powers and the United States, etc., allocating their pieces of their colonial ventures. So in a sense, it's considered a scientific voyage, and in part of that, the commitment is made to send talented voyage artists on these voyages, something that the French had obviously taken the lead from the voyages of Cook, and they wanted to make sure that they took some very, very skilled people who could perform image capture. And so in this case, it's a young man. His name is Louis Auguste de Sasson, and he's a young man who was a technical drawing clerk for the Navy. And they spotted his talent, and he was whisked on board on the voyages. And as a young man, he was paid a relatively large amount of money to create these to create all the sketches and the drawings from life of what he saw. And in my opinion, they're some of the highest quality images of Māori life prior to cameras around. They really are. The story. What's even more interesting, and I'll draw on it more, is that the fact that these people were sent to the other side of the world. They had minutes to capture scenes. The people weren't going to stand still for them like cameras. They captured scenes with the aid of pencils and pen and wash techniques, and they were literally the cameras of the day. And they captured these things very quickly, often seconds, minutes, and then these drawings were all brought back to France and sent to Paris-based lithography enterprises, who then translated and transferred them into printable medium. Now, what is significant about Dumont d'Urville's voyages is that the artist I mentioned, de Sasson, and this is the second voyage. The artist de Sasson accompanied his drawings to Paris and supervised the lithographs lithographers at work. So the distortion isn't as great as what it is, say, in earlier voyages by the Europeans, and they are really astounding images, in my opinion. So here's the entrance to the show, and some of the lithographs in question where I took the lithographs and I started reinterpreting these reinterpretations of other people's views of Māori, how they saw Māori people. Now, in my opinion, these types of works are kind of like the 19th century mass media of the day, of how Europeans and how Occidental people and Westerners saw my people, and to a large extent, how much of those attitudes and images were formed by these views, and how much do they remain to this day, And so I took these images, and I had the fortune to meet with the museum forwarded me to a lithograph enterprise that was going to be responsible, a reprographic enterprise that was going to be responsible for taking the images, because we had access to the original voyage atlases. These are precious publications. There are not many left in the world now. They're worth heaps of euros, and I couldn't believe that I had one under my arm. Obviously there was the person with the gloves, and from my beginning of this interest in 1990 to now, I'm in possession of the original voyage atlas. And from that, with this enterprise, I'm telling you, they were called Studio Ludo. We photographed the images, and then I was able to command them to do whatever I wanted with the photographs. And with the logician, I was able to say, look, I want you to remove the background of these lithographs you can see here around, and I want them as wide as possible around the foreground images. I wanted we played with the contrast in the color bars, and I pumped them. I made them hot. I wanted these images to try and be as vibrant as possible, because the originals are over nearly 200 years old now, and the pages are all, they're all kind of they're old and they're faded, and the pages are yellow, and I wanted them to look like they were just like brand new. Coupled with that, you can see I sculpted the frames for these works and painted them gold and presented them as you would European art. The classical format of like a red wall with gold frames filled to, it's how we're accustomed to seeing fine art from in Europe, and I imagine it's no different in the Met and other places of this presentation of art. And in doing that, I attempted to lift the status of these lithographs to the status of art classic. I wanted them to be treated that way, and I wanted them to be perceived that way, and imbue them with the power that they deserve. I also then sketched kōwhaiwhai, our patterns, our motifs of movement, and hand painted with the help of the museum, the back of them. So I wanted to put these images that were isolated and put them back into a Māori world that I chose. The same with, so we were taking the lithographs also, and I had the opportunity to make them life size. I wanted to make them as big as I could, and frame them with sculpture to really put them in the context of the whole exposition is about framing. It's about putting things into the context that they come from. But at the same time, I'm not in the business of photocopying the past, although it looks like it. I wanted to also make the past today. On one wall, I took the large panoramic prints, and I was able to I made them into the negative format. I wanted to make them sort of like spirit quality and a spirit connotation, and this formed the basis for my vitrines, to place my vitrines. So I take the vitrines and I sculpt the vitrines themselves. I wanted the actual vitrines to be an ancestor, and they contain and represent how collections and museums are presented. I made ancestors, and I made the treasures from the collections and the context that they come from. In other words, the weapons are held. They're not flat on the floor or pinned to a wall. The garments and the capes are worn. the amulets and the adornments are worn around the bodies of the ancestors. So it's, if you're familiar with my work, you know that's the kind of thing I do. Coupled with that, I was able to make contemporary works as well. Here's an astrolabe named after the ship of de Monteville, and these gave me an opportunity to make kinetic works that revolved and turned inside the exposition. On another wall, I was able to take like I said, I used the blue wall and copper treatment of the sculptures, the frames, and I was able to create works to give this sense of power. Look, as we see in Europe and places of large scale reproductions of historic moments and battle scenes and landscapes, where the work is both conveying power as well as being informative. Then I was able to move into photography and old ethnographic photographs of some of the works and mix them with a bust I made of de Monteville as I transformed them into a Māori. The same goes for, I took the drawings and I was able to engrave them onto plexiglass. So in a sense, I was making a psychic replay of what they did 200 years ago, taking their drawings and making engravings of their drawings and representing them back onto the audiences. People saw it like I was literally stepping out of the lithographs themselves and representing them. Now, what I want to talk about quickly, because I have limited time, is this idea of how things are presented in museums. These are examples of a museum in Taiwan where I made complete treatment of the space, of the ceiling, the walls, the floor, and every space. I took that idea further back into my home community and did the same treatment to our ancestral house on my marae, on the place of my tribe. I draw parallels to mosques and synagogues and other places of power where there's complete treatment everywhere and every part of the room's telling a story. This is in my ancestral house, in the meeting house of my tribe, and where discussions are made and where we sleep and funerals are held and the bodies are placed there. It's become my gallery as well and my museum, and with the help of the tribe, I put vitrines into that now so that we can curate our own stuff. Like I'm saying, I'm taking these inspirations from where I live in Europe. The idea that you could surround the space you're in, to offer a complementation to current museum practices of just and focusing on objects. I'll just say one last thing about this in my 35 years of experience, and that is that I see a trend that everyone's well aware of anyway, that there's a kind of a difference of perception with ethnographic museums and fine art museums like the Met, places like that, and natural history museums. They're seen as quite different things, you know? And the reason why is because it's money. Because fine art and ethnography net is big bucks into a tribal auction house in Sotheby's and Christie's. You know, it's big money. And natural history museums are seen as places where you take the kids on the weekends when it's raining. So, you know, there's a difference in perception, right? And secondly, there's this kind of elite high view, and it's not a reproach. I'm just merely trying to present this as a compliment in thinking that this idea that the visitor experience, right? The visitor experience that we associate with natural history, to go and see the dinosaurs or the volcanoes, or whatever. It's a visitor experience, and museums like the Met and other high art museums and ethnographic museums do not use that language. They do not say visitor experience because they don't. It's kind of almost down there, you know. It's like it's where you take the kids, and yet these places of power that I've just showed quickly, like the mosque, the palais, the cathedral, the tupuna whare, the ancestral house, they are visitor experiences. You go in there and you're completely surrounded with the experience. Every part of the space is treated. No part of the space is left out. Every single part of the space is telling a story. This idea that museums have of this kind of neutral space, of objectivity, of saying, look, we're just here to, like, you've got to pretend the vitrine doesn't exist. You've got to pretend because the designer has come up with these really cool neutral colors, which are really kind of in right now. And so that the emphasis is placed on what's in front of you. I understand the value of that, and it works. Of course it does. But I'm saying that to complement that, these other techniques and practices and things from the past have a practical function, and that is to bring the audience into that world, to cross, because I respectfully say that that museums around the world globally have plateaued in their presentation, in their role of reaching out to audiences. I think they've plateaued. I think that's the case in ethnography anyway. I think, how many more shows are we going to see of beautifully presented vitrines looking like organ banks of dislocated, disconnected, decontextualized stuff? And I'm saying, I present these ideas just in this brief time I've been given as a complement to that, just purely as complement. I'm not here, it's not as an adversarial role at all, but purely in a complementary role, and to bring the nuance of all that comes with it, because as Aaron said, it involves the communities and peoples as well. It involves people like me who are able to translate those cultural things to other audiences, and bringing all that together. I invite museums everywhere and anywhere to consider this. I really do. I think that's my time. Kia ora. I've put my email address on the chat guys, so if anybody wants to contact me, it's on there. Kia ora, thank you.
Hello, very good evening. A very good evening to everybody here. Thank you for the presentation before this. Thank you to the chair and the moderator. My name is Anupam. Like at various junctures in the human continuum, there is a time for prayer. And I suppose this is also one of those times. And as I speak just now from Bombay, where I am at the moment, this is the CSMVS Museum, where I presently work. I'm going to be taking us around with illustrations of objects from various parts of this subcontinent. And to begin with, I take you to this northeastern part of India in the state of Arunachal Pradesh, up in the mountains, in this climb, in this atmosphere of monasteries. You have this in the landscape. Now, these pieces of cloth on the poles are prayer flags. As the breeze blows, the woodblock printed prayers on these flags, when the flags flutter, these prayers are carried into the breeze and they go across various regions. And these are prayers for good health for everybody. And the communities, if the wind is blowing this other way, the communities which write these prayers for the happiness and well-being of all sentient beings, the breeze does not touch their village at all, but it goes far beyond the boundaries. It goes and creates a sense of well-being in principle and in an intangible sense to communities and strangers who they've never known or will never know. That is a goodness of people. But when such a flag comes into a museum, it is frayed and there are damages to it. It might come to a conservation center. And then you try to put those frayed edges back. The thing is that they were never meant to be. It is from these frays that the ethereal prayers go out for the well-being of everybody. And then they're put in a static showcase where there's not a single breeze that blows, or there's not even a whiff of air. And therefore, not only the museum staff, but the visitors themselves, in an intangible sense, are deprived of the benefits of these prayers. The material aspect is, of course, conserved. Of course it is. But the essence of the object is lost. There is so much information that we garner about these objects, whether it is on the label or it is in the wall text, or it is in the condition reports of us as conservators. There's information about the origin, about the period, about the material, the technology, the color, the polychromy. There's so much information about it. But we must remember that in this, sometimes the essence of the object is lost. The juice of the object is lost. Because we must remember that knowledge, blindness, now that we say blindness can be caused by the absence of light or the absence of knowledge. But it can also be caused in one way by too much of it also. Right? So we're not saying decrease knowledge, because that is absolutely essential. There's no two ways about it. But it is important to adjust the various. It is like talking about one end of one spectrum and the other end of the spectrum. Where will we get the rainbow if the rest of the spectrum is missing? So it is very important, and that is how you'll hit the pot of gold. And these objects, we must remember that when these objects are then once they are treated and we've created all this information around them, they are supposed to go into galleries for display. This is one of the views of the India and the World exhibition that was held in collaboration with the British Museum at the CSMVS Mumbai 1.5 years back. When I see the symposium and the wording of it, it is very, very clear that it is about introspection. So before we start thinking about listening to the public and hearing what they want to say so that we can modify our systems in our museums and in our professions and in us as human beings, I think we need to first introspect. We need to see who these people are. We're talking about having conversations with objects. So this is the Disco Bolas in that same exhibition with the Sui Jiankyo, the Chinese artist, and he's created this other one. So a lot of objects like this were placed in conversation with each other. This, for example, is an exhibition called Conserving the Collection. It's a series that we do. The first one was on nuances of conservation. The second one was on processes of conservation. The third one that we are working on now is taking a leaf from the Met. Literally so. Yesterday we had a discussion after you sent that invitation for this talk. We're going to have the next one on the conversations with the people who created these objects in light of the conservation of these objects. So that's coming up next year. Met, you'll be the chief guest for this. Thank you for putting this seed into our minds. Well, the people who will come for these exhibitions, they come with empty cups and they take in whatever they can. Things touch people's lives in its own way. And it's a very dynamic process. We are not there to judge it. We cannot. There are other people who come, and one sees, as a pattern you see, people are most comfortable with objects they are familiar with. And it's a pattern. People tend to linger on objects they are a little familiar with. Just like all of us prefer to hear the music which we've already heard before, and we say, oh, that's good, that's good. Then there is this category of the public who do not physically visit the institution, but who visit it in a virtual form. And more of that will be happening and is happening these days. And yet there is another public which never will visit the museum, or never does, or may never. And it is this public also that we need to pay attention to. They are completely out of our radar, so to speak. It is these people who create, for example, in this context, because we're talking about the northeastern part of India, we're talking about the Buddhist community here, for example. It is these people who put the manuscripts together. There are traditions and things to learn from this itself, not just in terms of display, but also in terms of conservation, in terms of education. Museums have two purposes. One is a purpose of ensuring the longevity of the object. If a museum takes the objects, hundreds and thousands of them, and locks them up and keeps them for 100 years, that is a very important purpose, mind you. Otherwise, not much would have been left if things were not locked up inside repositories. At the same time, museums are also an intellectual. They were created. They were an intellect. They were a scientific institution to begin with, even in the 18th century, late 18th century especially. So it is this aspect of education, dissemination, and this knowledge creation where this involvement with the local communities is imperative, absolutely imperative. Even in terms, for example, in this, just as an illustration, the way they tie the manuscripts between the wooden boards, and you see that golden little metal piece there, it is so that when the reader is opening the manuscript, every time there's a rotation of the manuscript, this golden thing comes and he sees it just as the sun that rises to dispel all the darkness of ignorance. So that's the principle behind it. We would be just so much more richer. Eventually, we will read the text. But it just touches you in that little way. And that is important, especially in cultures like ours. We must remember when we're talking about the past and the present, here there is no past and the present. It's all mixed up together. And that's why we sometimes do not even think of heritage as heritage, because you're living it. What do you do with this category of people who are living their traditions, whose museums are full of objects which are their living traditions also? It's interesting. And therefore, we must remember also that, like a prawn, when you take out the shell from the prawn, or you take out the skin from the grape, maybe that's a better analogy. What a pity. The grape is not whole. And we must remember it is the skin which gives the color to the wine. So if we cannot take out that skin of the intangibleness of things, even in a place where the material is exalted, where the material is celebrated, it is time for museums to celebrate the other nuances around the objects also. And many museums do. Another public is the people from whose communities we have taken these objects. And as a subset, there is another community, there's another public, which is detached from this whole aspect of the artwork, because they have never created the artwork. They are the ones who process the raw materials. But they are also equally important. They form another aspect in this network. I work a lot with a systems approach, whether it's to art conservation or working with communities. And you find these networks are so beautifully interlinked. An intervention at an appropriate place and an apparently unrelated place in the system can impact the entire system in a manner you may feel. But of course, there's always the butterfly effect. So sometimes the effects, if you don't visualize it correctly, sometimes they can go out of control also. We have to be careful. And then once all that interaction is done with the objects, even as conservators, in the museum, it's the curators, but then there's so many other people. I'm speaking for one of the communities of people in conservation. You take back this to the community and work with them in conserving the objects, or at least learning, because there are many, many things which we may not have learned. After all, our learning has also come from all what our elders have given us, and from the books that all you good people have written, and from the experiences that have been gained, but always physical exposure to things. So the local community always helps you to enrich yourself a little bit. So why not? And these communities extend from every part of the subcontinent, so that the conversation eventually is not just between the objects and the objects. The conversation is between us who are taking care of the objects also, and the object. And also the object and the visitor, but we can't be excluded from this equation. We would not like to. And how things are created, how metals are created, the way the textiles and the fabrics are created, the weave against the weave with the weave, the embroidery, the materials, the profusion of skills and the nimble hands. All the sculptures that we see in our museums are all at a certain eye level. But in situ, they were never meant to be at eye level. Some of them were supposed to be high up there, and some of them were supposed to be low. How about looking at them from that angle to get that sense of awe when looking at a deity, for example, or love for a deity who's lovable? There's so many lovable deities in India, right? And the people who create these things, it's not just stone, it is butter, for example. Transient objects, which we sometimes replicate in fiberglass so that they can live in the hot climate in a tropical country like India, so that you can disseminate the aspects of these mountain traditions. I come from the northwestern part of the Himalayas myself. This from the northeastern part. And how we must remember, like they said, no man is an island. Neither are institutions islands. Neither are these practices, living traditions are not islands either. For example, in this case, a change in animal husbandry rules and regulations in a certain part of India changed the type of cattle, which changed the quality of milk. And the butter that was produced would never congeal in the temperatures there, because of which this practice of creating butter sculptures fell into disuse and the rituals could never be completed. So it's phenomenal how these networks then work with each other. We need to also be able to see larger networks beyond the premises of an institution like a museum. We are a public institution. We have to look beyond the shores of our hearing and our seeing. And as Goethe also said, Goethe had said once, he said this thing about to be able to see with feeling eyes. And he also said to be able to feel with seeing hands. When you experience an artwork, touching an art object is anathema these days. You can't. But what are the various ways in which you can do? Because we must remember, people tend to touch objects which we want to possess. And when we are looking at a public or we do our visitor surveys, it's not just going and talking to them. It is important to observe our visitors and see them and see how they behave. Do they want to touch an object? And I think it's something to be celebrated. If a person wants to possess something which is in a museum, it shows you've touched a chord somewhere. So we need to be open to at least being able to see such things. And later it can be articulated or not articulated as a practice that you may allow or not allow. But we must be open to these conversations. And the last thing I want to say is about the documentation. This is simple. An art object is documented for various purposes, for the public, for academics, for scholarly research, for conservation. But when it comes to living traditions, because you must remember that it was from living traditions eventually that all manifestations of human endeavor and everything formed as artworks. Documentation of living traditions is tricky because it changes the status quo. It's a law of physics. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle also says that when you put light on something to see, you put light on an atom or a part of an atom to see it, it shifts its position. It is never its true position. You can never pinpoint the real position of something. It happens when you're walking and a lovely person looks at you, you tend to either trip or the ice cream falls down or something happens. The moment light falls on you, which is observation, the thing shifts. And when there's too much of it, when we as art historians, when we as museum acquisition committees or people in these teams, when we go out into these communities and document, sometimes things shift and the elastic limit is reached and the things shift and they do not come back ever. But we must remember that things are about evolution. Things evolve. So it is not wrong that you document something, but I'm just saying that be careful because that is what happens sometimes in the documentation of things. Because when you're talking about colonialism also, it is about first going somewhere, recording everything, documenting everything. And if it leads to certain things which are about, it impoverishes a community, suppose, eventual exploitation, it impoverishes a community, there's a complete domination of something. We must remember that it is only after that that conservation starts happening. It is true for objects, it is true for living communities, it is true for natural history also, animals also. The tigers were decimated, then conservation came in, often by the same people. But these are things that we must keep in mind. And therefore, finally, it comes back to this thing about once these things are conserved. This, by the way, is Chunda. She's the 17th century. She protects you from diseases and other things. And then these are put back and then they're displayed. And I leave you with this interesting thing. This is the international airport in Mumbai. And there has 7,000 ethnographic objects displayed in a 1.2, almost 2 kilometer long display within the airport. If you ever miss, people are missing flights just to be able to see this entire collection. I'm joking. But see how they've displayed it. It is displayed, but this is the challenge. Could you contribute to them in some way or the other in being able to make this come alive with the aspects that we talked about just now? About the public, about the various types of public. But these are ethnographic objects from every part of the subcontinent. displayed in its airport, but just displayed as decoration at the moment. And once we are a little attentive and sensitive to all of this, then the objects can converse with us and we with them. And we are the public and we are the custodians of the objects, all at the same time. And once we have a good system in place, once we feel in all sincerity that it is a good way of doing things, then you can send these objects and these methods of dissemination out into the public, share it with the children and the younger generation. It would be a pity to share half-baked things with where there could have been a little more sensitivity. This is our present today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, that was amazing. I certainly learned a lot. So thank you for sharing your research and all your profound insights with us. I'm really looking forward to this Q&A. And the chat has been really active, but I want to take advantage of my role as moderator and ask the first question. And my first question is actually about technology and digital tools. I'm wondering if you all could talk about how the internet and digital methodologies might have transformed your either scholarly / curatorial practices or your creative practices.
Maybe I'll start since I invoked the digital as one of the categories in my talk. Although I'm really looking forward to hearing what George and Anupam have to say. I loved their presentations and there's so many interesting things that I want to talk about them both with. I mean, for me as an academic, you know, like I think so many academics, having access to archives and collections online has sort of changed the process of research. Although it never replaces going to repositories and experiencing things firsthand. My sense is from community points of view too, you know, digitizing collections and archives is great. It's a kind of access. It's better than not access, but it doesn't replace physical contact, presence, and to be in the presence of belongings in museums and archives. So on the one hand, the possibilities for access to materials for research, artistic research, community-based cultural heritage research, academic research across the board. But then I think, you know, there's other questions about presentation and what digital media afford in terms of presentation, both in spaces like gallery spaces that I talked about, and online, and the way in which digital media allows, while it can never replace materiality, it has its own materiality. It can never replace the experience of the materiality of the thing and the kinds of material relationships that people can engage with objects. It can never replace that, but it can do other things that can have some benefits in terms of modes of interpretation, visualization, but also potential engagement. I'm thinking about George's point about museum spaces being enlivened and sort of activated and experienced. And we were certainly thinking about things like that. And we had conversations about what to do with, you know, we had these photos of Boas posing as in the stance of this Hamadza dancer. And initially, my idea was to sort of have those still images of Boas superimposed over the mannequins. So you'd see like 6 Boases at once, static. And it was Corinne Hunt in Dialogues who said, no, the dioramas are already static. Like the whole thing is that the diorama is a freeze frame of what was a dance and in motion. And the diorama was static. The Boas's book plate of the diorama was doubly static. So how can we re-enliven the diorama? And so it was really her idea to have these sort of dissolving projections. Now, of course, it's Boas performing, right? It's not a dancer dancing. So we're sort of mediating anthropology's mediations of the dance. It's sort of, mediations all the way down. But what I hope that visitors would think about in attending to what the digital media do is to think about the fact that it's media, that this isn't direct access to culture, it's access to all of these intermediary forms of representation. And the exhibit is one of them. And so there, I think the use of digital media in the exhibition context can call attention to itself as a form of representation and not just as a neutral arbiter of knowledge. And I'll stop there.
That was a great response. I mean, I think it's something that we're all thinking about as scholars and museum professionals. Like, what does digital media, art of digital, make possible? I mean, we're all sitting here, in France and Mumbai and New York City having a conversation. So there's benefits, and certainly there's pitfalls as well. I want to go to a question that's actually in the chat. Attendee named Trinidad Ricardo wrote, what advice would you give to museums to improve the exhibition of objects that require a level of public interaction to present them not only as relics, but also offer the experience that a specific object would provide in its environment or in that culture? And that question was particularly directed towards George or Anupam.
Yeah, well, that's basically what I'm doing, is trying to at least convey the context, the spirit of the context of whatever that treasure is, and with the means at my disposal. Like, if I see objects of power that perform a certain function in the Māori culture, then I try to present them in that way. I will carve an ancestor holding that particular, or wearing or being adorned with it in the way that it's seen, as opposed to it being flat on a board or pinned against the wall, like what people might seem used to. The other side of what I'm doing personally is that, like with my treatment with vitrines, is probably the complete contrary to current museum practice, where the vitrine is the containment device, and the public is like I said in my presentation, is kind of asked to imagine that it doesn't exist. So it's a kind of a look but don't touch kind of deal, right? So I treat the vitrine as an art object itself and as an ancestor, and it allows people to touch it. It allows people to make contact, physical contact with their hand, with the tattoos on the ancestor's body or face, without, and at the same time I'm still playing ball by the rules of the institution, because the things that are in the custody of the institution are still contained. But just getting back quickly to your comment about the digital thing, like you said, it's aided me personally and all of us personally in being able to communicate and more effectively, and through the wire, etc. But I do notice that within institutions, and say, let's talk about contemporary art, there's more and more and more as we speak. There's going to be more and more video and digital artists popping up and getting gigs, because it's easier. Because it's easier to send a file than to have a guy like me build a temple. It's just easier, and museums will go down the easy path before they'll take the risk. They will. They won't take on a crazy half cannibal Michelangelo guy like myself, who will kill himself to achieve his objective, and go without sleep and go without food and do what it has to be done to realize that vision. No, it's actually easier if we just get the video artist instead, because it's the way things are, like there's time constraints, budgetary constraints, it's more and more turning into those are the parameters that institutions it just means that those digital artists are going to get more shows. They're going to be the ones at the biennales and at the triennales, and the people who make things off their hands are I'm banking on the pendulum swinging back. I am. I'm banking that
Pendulum.
eventually it's going to swing back, and there's just on the basis of that, there's less practitioners like me than digital practitioners. So perhaps I might get considered that way. Yeah.
The pendulum. Sorry.
Just that. Yeah. What I'm saying is just that I'm all about the tactile. I'm a sculptor, so my eyes are on the tips of my fingers. I teach my students that you have to take your fingers and imagine that they've got eyeballs on them, and you have to see with your hands. You have to see. In France, I'm not. What I do by media in France, they don't say I'm an artist. They say, George, you are not an artist. And I was a bit offended when they said that. And they said, you do not make art. You are not an artist, because in our view of art now, as it exists now, it is cerebral. And what you do is we call you, and they called me a visionnaire manuel. In other words, the visions are handmade. The visions come from the hands, and all I'm saying is that the digital tradition, because it's a tradition now, is ranks equally with the traditions of the past. There's no judgment here. They're all fantastic tools, like you said in your presentation, sir, that they're an evolution and all that. But I'm saying, yeah, but be careful that we don't have just only that we're just going to have objects and then we're going to have screens and nothing else. There's the chance of that. There's the practitioners who are still crazy enough to make things by hand are considered scenography. And I like to blur the distinction between the scenography and the art object or the art itself. I'm in the business of completely blurring that boundary, like it is in a mosque, like it is, I said, like it is in a church or a palace or an ancestral house in Alert Bay, where it's all art and nothing is art. It's just like you said, it's just living continuum, living tradition, alive. That you are in the business of making the old new again and again and again and again. And out of that, crazy new ideas and innovations come out of that. So perhaps the digital thing is that another form of innovation, but because of its convenience, because we're talking about convenience now, it goes down the wire, that convenience rules our lives. And convenience can make things a bit mediocre. There's a danger of that too, because some things have to be really, really, it has to be like put everything on the line to make it extraordinary, to reach sublime. You've got to put everything on the line. It's not a comfortable exercise, guys. It's not about comfort necessarily. It's not about convenience. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you, George. So when Goethe was talking about people who are able to see with their feeling hands or feel with their seeing hands, it's people like you we had in mind. Jonathan, with your kind permission, I'd just like to thank Trinidad for the question and just say one thing, that I won't be presumptuous to say how to improve the exhibition of objects, but I would definitely say that this thing about to present them not only as relics, we must remember that when we are putting something in a static form, we are turning something into a remnant of the past. So it is important to do in a way what George has also said. It's about creating an interactive space also where that object can also be touched and felt and used as it is supposed to be used. If you see, so many toys fell into disuse. They're all remnants of the past now. They're relics to be put in a museum. The ball is still alive in so many forms because it never went out of touch. It never went out of that. So I think that interactive space is very, very important. Every other toy went out of it. That's all. Just an interactive space where you can use the object. Thank you.
Anupam, do you mind if I follow up with you? Because I feel like in your presentation, you offered a lot of methodological tips and strategies. And I feel like I just want to dwell in that space a little bit more. And I really was struck by what you said about introspection. So I'm wondering if you can offer any more tools or tips or strategies, because there are a lot of like museum professionals and scholars who are like watching right now. Like, what advice would you give to someone to sort of be more engaged, to be more in touch with objects, but also with makers of those objects?
As a field worker, I can answer as a field worker that it is important to sit down and just see things. It is important to sit down and not work too much. It's just see some things, spend some time just seeing things the way things are, and not think about any judgment about it, or just observe. That has one space in your body that creates a space full of some observations. And then in a very detached manner, but you have to be detached. In a detached manner, you have to see what is it that one wants to really address? And what is it? And how is it that by doing, in fact, you should go by the problem. What is it that needs to be addressed? And after that, once you've observed all this, and you feel that this is the way to make it work, it's then that you marry them too intellectually. I think it's just about seeing quietly first, but in a very detached manner. If you have a self-interest in mind, it shifts your position. Somehow it doesn't work. It will happen, but it's more beautiful, and it's like an arrow when you detach from the fruits of it. It works. Eventually the fruits do come. So no worries on that.
That was beautiful. Thank you. I want to go back to you, George, because you're about to go into a critique of natural history museums versus fine art museums. And I thought that was really interesting. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of go back to that, because there were a lot of interesting ideas that I'd love to hear you tease out more.
Okay. Well, I work more and more on projects where I cross institutions, where I currently have a large exposition in the Museum de Genève, the Natural History Museum of Geneva, where it's about my use of plastic in the ocean, okay, and it's a kind of natural history topic, pollution and water, and it's what we're all talking about, right? Plastic, etc. And in doing that, I presented my works in conjunction with specimens of flora and fauna from my country, species that are endemic to Aotearoa, New Zealand, okay? And at the same time, was able to secure loans from Swiss ethnographic collections of Māori material and brought them into the Natural History Museum. And mixed it all together with my plastic, like I do, because I'm a crazy guy. And voila, it's George's take on the Te Ao Māori, the natural world. And all I'm trying to do is somehow artfully break down this kind of invisible, like the plexiglass, this invisible kind of wall between culture and nature. And that how can we separate them? When, I mean, the most vivid examples are indigenous peoples, where there is no distinction between culture and nature. And yet at the same time, the thing about natural history museums is that they're the ones saying that we're connected in their view of species and this family of this genus or that. They're the ones purporting that the interconnectivity and the interrelationship of things in nature. So, it's kind of like a new conversation in the humanities, but it's really an old conversation in natural history and like I said, amongst the communities themselves. So I make it my business to throw it all together. And the challenge the challenge I face as a practitioner, as an artist, is how to present that in the most artful way I can, with the most nuanced way I can, because I end up with the common reactions I get from audiences that they're saying to me, George, it's so horrible and it's so beautiful. You know, and you can see that their feelings are really going through the ringer. You know, they're looking at something so toxic, and yet it takes their breath away with the beauty of it. And for me, at least the audiences are feeling something, eh? At least they're getting a feeling. At least they're walking out of that institution with feelings, with strong feelings, because, you know, what else are they going to really remember? You know, we forget names, we forget dates, we forget this, we forget that, but we don't forget those, when those feelings hit us like and they penetrate, you know, and they pierce the facade. That's what I do. It's what I get out of bed for, to do that. And because I know that it's a tried and tested thing in all the cultures of the world. When you walk into a mosque, or you walk into that palace, as I keep on saying, or you walk into that synagogue, you are in a space that has an intention. It has an intention. It has an intention to command your attention. To say, okay, you turn your phone off now. You don't think about picking up your groceries or who you gonna Facebook or whatever. You're not there for that. You leave all your baggage at the door, and you come in and you give it a chance. You give yourself a chance. You give the time a chance. You know, and otherwise, I don't think we're going to really progress. It's always going to be a limited moment, when it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be that limited. We've got everything, as all the presenters have said. We've got everything. We've got the sum of all the parts to make it beyond a limited moment. We have. It involves taking risks. It involves being incredibly brave, and it involves mutual respect and trust between the parties. And that's the biggest part. There must be trust, and that trust obviously is coming from, based on things like competence and respect, etc. But without trust, forget it. Just forget it. You know.
What is? Oh, sorry, Nupam. Do you want to jump in?
Just one thing. I really like what George said about for the space to have an intention. You know, I think that's really, really poignant and so practical also at the same time. It's beautiful.
I mean, this is all coming from practical stuff, right? Cultures and practice. You know, it's practical. You know.
Yeah. And talking of practical, Jonathan, one addendum to what was in terms of the methodology that you asked about, is that other than what I said, the second very, very important, which has always stood in good stead, is the repeat observation or the repeat visit to what you want to do. It is for the same people, the same things, the same behavior. It always changes with time a little bit. We're talking about intervals of even a day, right? But repeats are very, very important for noting down and eventually forming whatever strategies. Thank you.
Great. I mean, that's really helpful. We have a question in the chat that's actually related to the conversation that we're having right now in terms of like visitor engagement. The attendee asks, when documenting and archiving performances and living traditions, how can museums prevent the prescription of cultural authority and authenticity, since no two performances are the same?
Indeed. Nothing's the same. I mean, every single moment is being redefined, right? Redefinition is a daily occurrence in itself, you know. I for that reason alone, I can't ever place myself in the position of saying I'm speaking on behalf of the Māori culture. I can't. That's just folly to say that. But I'll say this is what I think. This is what I feel. This is my opinion. This is my view, and I'll own that. You know, and the thing is going to come down to the people are going to feel the difference, eh? They're just going to feel the difference. They're going to feel the difference whether they've been someone's pulling a fast one or not. They're gonna people are not that stupid. They're going to feel whether someone's sincere or not. They're going to feel because when that person steps forward to be that person who's going to purport their culture or whatever in that moment, like our esteemed colleague from Mumbai said, you're stepping into the light. You're stepping into the spotlight, and everything about you is seen. Everything, not just what you think you can. Oh, I'm going to get them to see this part of me, but they're not going to see that part. It doesn't work like that. People see all. The old people are the best at it, and the kids, they got X-ray vision. They can see right through you. They scan you like in a heartbeat, and especially children, because they're like walking honesty machines. So I'll just call it like it is, and that people, if they haven't got a grip on that, then they're not ready to do those roles. They're not ready, and they should go back and do what it takes to get ready. Yeah,
I think that the question of it's interesting that Anupam brought up documenting living traditions, because of course that is what the history of anthropology has done, right? That's what ethnography, all these ethnographic inscription practices are about, documenting living traditions. A century ago, in that sort of moment of salvage anthropology, there was the sort of frantic drive to document what was perceived to be vanishing. Okay, hopefully we're not in that moment anymore. But that was certainly the spirit in which that was happening a long time ago. And there is always the danger that the inscription itself freezes those traditions. And one of the things that I've been most sort of interested in working as a contemporary anthropologist is working with the afterlives of all of that stuff in the present, and the ways in which communities wrestle with these inscriptions, and also wrestle with them, but also resignify them, and do things like George does: take these old ethnographic representations and resignify them, remediate them, literally, right? Translating them into new media, re-indigenizing them, things like that. So I think that there's ways that museums can deploy the archive, these past representations, bringing them into present in different ways. Obviously, having multiple voices is one way to decenter the curatorial authority of the contemporary museum, right? Have other people speak from their points of view, but also for the voices of the museum to talk about the limits of knowledge, the limits of what the institution can know about the things that it has and studies, how we know what we know, being more transparent about the way in which the knowledge behind curatorial labels are developed, authoring curatorial labels so that the voice of that knowledge is apparent. And I think also museums can work to redefine the criteria for what authenticity is to begin with, so that authenticity, say, for Indigenous people, is not fidelity to what was done centuries ago. That's not what makes Indigenous people authentic. And so, for instance, to go back to my exhibit, we ended with this contemporary whale mask. And right before that, there had been a little section of the exhibit, which I didn't talk about, which was about commercial replicas. So a century ago, Boas's book got back to the Northwest Coast, and souvenir dealers used it to create new versions of objects, which they released into the souvenir market. Funny, some of those have ended up in museums. People don't know that they're souvenir remediations of stuff. That's a different story. But we had just talked about replicas, right? And then we have this contemporary whale mask, and we were very explicit in the labeling, and with Karine talking about the mask in the video in the same room, to say, this is not a replica. This is Lucy's mask. This is a new iteration of this mask. It will be validated in a ceremony. It was made by contemporary artists just last week. It's in an exhibit. It was not in a vitrine because the artists didn't need it to be in a vitrine, which was great. And, we made very explicit that this was not a replica. This is an authentic iteration of Lucy's Mask. And it can be ceremonially reactivated. That culture is, the genealogy behind that mask has been reactivated. And so the object can be reactivated in the present. That itself should disrupt the sense that only the old stuff in museums is authentic, and what's being made now has some kind of other relationship to it. So I think there's various strategies that we can use in the present to sort of decenter that sort of institutional authority over what past things are, but also present things.
I say to people one thing. I try and keep it simple in one line, and I say, look, don't worry, it'll be traditional by this afternoon. And I'm not being flippant when I say that either. And if we want to talk about what is the ultimate authentication of culture, well, the answer is simple, and that's death. Death authenticates your culture. Death does. And those things, those treasures that are held in museums, the rules and the codes that those cultures were bound by in the production of those treasures, any deviance in error or any wrong intent cost a life. That's what makes them so potent. That's how the line between living and dying is so thin that you can't even see it. Not like now, where we're sort of cushioned from it and where everybody's so afraid of dying that they don't know how to live. This is, you want to talk about what makes something authentic. That's what it comes down to, is death. People die for those things. That's the certainty that you can sort of like, you know that's real, man. You know that's real because those things cost lives. They're meant to. That's what makes them so strong. That's how come they can last through traveling thousands of miles and over the centuries and be in other places. And that part of them, that supernature aspect of them, is no less potent than when it was first created, because it comes with all that. Because that's what we're all made of, men. We're all made of stories. We're all made of stories. We carry our stories with us everywhere we go, and we introduce our stories to other people's stories, and all the stories all get all mixed up and everything. But that's all. That's what ultimately what we're all made of, and that's probably the last landscape left in Indigenous peoples, is that landscape between their ears. That's probably the last territory that belongs to them, that can't be taken from them, is their stories. And what are they doing? They're making stories today. But they're taking the best parts of and their own, and they, I don't know if they are fully, but we're all better, and that's own the good and the bad parts of the stories. Own them. Own the lot. So that we can make the flip from victims to victors over ourselves, so that we're no longer victims of change, but agents of change. Because that's what the ancestors did when the big ships first came. The first thing they did was they enacted agency. They said, okay, we'll swap you this stuff for that. Give us that piano. Give us that pair of scissors. Give us that mirror. Give us that gun. We'll give you this. That's agency. That's not being a victim. That's being an agent. And if we can somehow keep that part of the tradition of being agents, then the rest is whatever we say it is. If someone goes along and makes a mask out of a Coca-Cola can, that's their call. As long, behind that, their intent, the agency of it is still functioning, then, oh man, knock yourself out. That's what I say. I mean, I use plexiglass. I use styrofoam. I use plastic bottles. I use the things people abhor, and take them and put them in museums. Museums give that stuff to me because it's all out the back, It's all their old vitrines and all their old places. George, you want all this? I said, that's treasure to me. Give it here. And I transform it. Everything is transformative. It's all about transformative. And and I say to myself, well, don't forget, George, no one ever said this was a popularity contest. You're going to get hated. You're going to get this. You're going to get that. It's all part of it too. You're going to get quit challenged. Bring it, please. It's good for my health. Challenge me. Oh, it's not all just like, George, you're a wonderful guy. What you do is amazing. Oh, you said amazing, great, beautiful things. It's not just that. There's the other side of it too. That's all part of it. It's just that we can't let go of being agents. We can't, because the cost was so high to get us here, so that we can be in this moment, alive, the communities, talking to each other, existing. What the old people did for us to be here, the price was so high. We better make good on it every day. Make good on what they did, so that we can be here, and for God's sake, look and at least look at what we've got, not just focusing on what we don't have. Look at what we have, because what we have is incredible. Even if it's like that much, I mean, as a Māori descendant, perhaps relatively speaking, our story is a little bit different in terms of what happened with collections than other cultures. For sure, we swapped everything. We swapped it all. We sold it all. We gave it all away for all the right reasons, I say, so that I could be here. So that I could, my children, my grandchildren, etc., can carry on this continuum and continue to be agents. And that's what those treasures do in those museums. They are agents. They speak loud, man. They have personalities, because they were made under those conditions where people didn't hold back, where people didn't have mediocre thoughts when they were in the production of those things. They had systems and ways of doing things that kept your mind, body, and soul in the right place. No distractions, focusing on what you're doing, getting closer and closer as you can to the ancestor, to the gods, or whatever it is that you're getting close to. And you can't do that by being mediocre, man. You can't. It's what I've termed it, this globalization of mediocrity in the name of money. That's causing a retardation of thinking and a poverty of spirit. The biggest poverty, a poverty of spirit. And that way, the institutions, this is the supreme irony of it, is that the institutions play the pivotal role, because they are the ones where all this human endeavor is concentrated. That's where the treasure is. That's what we can take from it. That we could be in awe of these people that made these things. We can be in awe of these of the things that people created, for better or worse. This sense of agency has this potential to be transmitted to every single soul on the planet. It's right there in front of us, man. It ain't over there. It's right here. In Māori, we say, whaia te iti kahurangi, which means seek the precious things in life. And in that sentence, they use the word iti, okay? Iti means small. So they're implying that the precious things in life are small. They're small enough to fit under your nose. They're right under our nose. They're not over there far, far away. They're right. You'd be surprised how close they are to us, and the people around us, and the signs that we must read on our journey through the day, and all the signs that are offered up, and all the directions that are offered up. It's just like what our brother from Mumbai said. You just got to see it, man. Got to hear it. Got to sit down. Got to keep still. That's a pathway to being wealthy.
Well, you said it wasn't a popularity contest. Well, you've been very popular in the chat. Someone said they want to be you when they grow up. So I want to go to a question that was posed to Aaron. An attendee wrote, I'm thinking of the title of the study Boas and Hunt produced, i.e. on secret societies. I'm wondering how the work you're doing collectively now gets taken up within ongoing systems, social, political, today. and in the future. To put my question succinctly, what takes off when people, things, relationships are reactivated beyond the museum, scholarship, etc.?
Thank you for the question. So one of the reasons that the critical edition team and I decided to go back to this book that's over a century old was not just because it was sort of important in the history of anthropology, but because it's been important in the history of Kwakwaka'wakw communities. That it was the first book to widely publish images of Kwakwaka'wakw art, and because of that, for a long time, the book got back to the British Columbia as soon as it was published, even before it was published, right? Boas sent page proofs back to George Hunt. And so copies of it have been circulating in the villages on the coast ever since it was published. And it's had this sort of really important role in the history of communities and the history of museums, which used the book as a kind of collecting guide to produce their own Kwakwaka'wakw collections and exhibitions. It guided the rest of Boas and Hunt's own relationship with one another. So it's been really influential in ways that have been underappreciated. Then there's these sort of hidden histories behind the production of the book that's been important. But one of the reasons we really wanted to do this, and one of the reasons we're doing it in print media, but also in digital media, is to put all these, to reassemble this vast distributed network of materials, of collections of belongings in museums around the world, but also photographs and manuscripts and cylinder recordings, because we see that as Boas and Hunt saw it initially, which is as a kind of archive of living culture, not of dead culture or dying culture. And so part of our motivation is to bring all those materials back into articulation with one another so they can be reactivated. How they're going to be reactivated, I can't predict. I mean, we've seen a few reactivations. We've seen Corinne and her family, create this new instantiation of Lucy's mask with the prompt of the exhibit, but also with the prompt of bringing it back into ceremony. We've seen that, carvings of new rattles, a form of rattle that hadn't been made in a century, again, for the exhibit. But once these things are sort of reactivated, once the knowledge really behind the objects can be reconnected with the kin units to whom that knowledge belongs genealogically, then anything's possible. And our goals are not to sort of facilitate just the recreation of old looking things. Doesn't matter what these things look like. What matters is that they're alive again. A lot of indigenous people talk about both belongings themselves and the knowledge that's in museums as being dormant or sleeping, waiting for the moment that the people who have ongoing relationships with those can wake them up. And so in a way, what we see is that our project, we hope, has the potential to facilitate that sort of reawakening of connections between people and knowledge, between people and knowledge and objects, between these sort of networks that Anupam was talking about, the whole networks, material and social and cosmological, ecological networks that we're all embedded in. And that, we chose, we're doing a book, we're doing a digital project, which will live on the internet. We wanted to do an exhibit because it circulates in the world in different ways, and which the few things that were in the exhibit were not digitally mediated, or not only. And that really all this is about, reactivating networks of people and relations. Yesterday, a lot of people talked about relationality and museums as nodes in sort of networks of relations. And that's really how I see our work too.
Great. Well, we have time for maybe one more question. There is a question from an attendee named Valerie, and they ask, what museums are missing is communication. What museums are missing is the communication of passion and spirit that the creators of the objects have, as we witness here with George Nuke. Yet, how do you capture the individual authentic spirit that is to capture the essence of a society and to share that to a public?
I don't think there's just one authentic spirit. You're gonna,
Well, I would second that.
You would have 1,000 artists with each having 1,000 authentic spirits within a given community. It's just a case of who you're going to put up, and it's always going to be an interesting shuffling of deck of cards. Yeah.
We're doing completely agree with what George said. And so on this count, there's a virtual exhibition that we are working out, and it's like a small little passion project for the center. What we're doing is we are creating, because there's not one of those things, so we've got 5 co-curators with 5 different stories to be launched simultaneously. So, different people can relate to different types of the spirit, so to speak, because all spirits are energetic, whether they are, so they can all go to the 5 different stories, because some will appeal to some, maybe 2 may appeal to some, maybe all will appeal, but everyone is made differently, and so are the curators and the people who create these stories. So as many storytellers, as many audiences. So, and the spirits are all there. It's for everyone to, find out which one touches who. So that's coming up. It's a virtual exhibition with an institution of architecture, actually. So we're collaborating with them. The institution is called CEPT, CEPT, and with the CSMB. So that's coming up. So just to somewhat not answer that, but to add on to that question.
That's actually an important point. We've gotten a number of questions about how we can follow your work. Where can we see any exhibitions that are upcoming? So where can people follow you or see your work? Do you have any upcoming exhibitions or publications that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so maybe I'll send the details over or something. Yeah, then you could share it if you wish.
If I can say something personally about exhibitions and experiences, and that if you can put something together and the audience comes and somewhere in the room they see themselves, then it's worth it. They say, I can see myself over there. Yeah. And then we can start, then we're all doing our role, our participating together to build empathy. Because we got to have empathy. We all know what the lack of empathy causes. It's horrendous. Yeah. And maybe this vehicle of culture and art is the very thing that can be at this spearhead of the salient point of rebuilding empathy. Because broadly speaking, in terms of the peoples, the cultures, what it's been doing over these few decades is restoring confidence, the restoration of confidence, and with that, as the people have their confidence in themselves restored, then all the other things can come too, like acceptance and patience and like I said, and empathy, that I could see through your eyes, that you could see through my eyes, and if I could just it's what I do with my work. If I could just take my eyes out of my head and put them in your eyes, then you would see what I see when I look at the plastic. But I can't do that, so I got to do all this other crazy stuff so that symbolically you can see through my eyes and see, this is what I see when I see this plastic. How beautiful it is in my eyes. How there's beauty in everything, even in the trash. In the pollution, whatever, that we could do a 180-degree turn and flip the thing that society abhors and denies and turn it into the thing that we can't take our eyes off. Therefore, we will get closer to the issue. We'll get closer to each other so that we skin to skin, so close. so that we're like breathing in each other's ear, kissing each other, so that we could just get closer, man. That's all. We could be each other somehow. And then ultimately we were like standing together next to each other, all together looking at ourselves in the mirror at the same time. You know, that's the exciting thing about these institutions, because they can do that. They're arenas for that. They're an oasis for this global mediocrity, this poverty, the spirit poverty, this all this stuff, retardation, poverty. They're an oasis for that, you know. That's the place, because those things that are inside those institutions have been tested through time. They have been validated by death, by everything else. People have made war, made love, sweated, bled, perspired, killed each other, loved each other, did everything in the name for those things. So, you know, they come with that. It counts for something.
Well, I think that's a beautiful way to end this panel. Thank you for sharing those profound thoughts. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your research. This has been a pleasure. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everyone watching has learned a lot as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.